Global warming. You've heard the dire warnings many times. Our use of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas is building up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, CO2, is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat that would otherwise escape into outer space. Former Vice President Al Gore warns that man-made global warming could increase sea levels by 20 feet, spin up deadly hurricanes, even plunge Europe into an ice age. Our only hope, supposedly, is an immediate freeze on U.S. carbon dioxide emissions and a host of new taxes and regulations to cut emissions 70, 80, even 90%. We're supposed to believe that this plan and others, like the Kyoto Protocol, won't harm our economy, but will actually make us wealthier. Above all, we're told that we have no choice. The stakes are too high, the threat too great.
The consensus view on man-made global warming. It's real. We're causing it mainly, vast majority of it. The consequences are bad and will be catastrophic unless we act.
But many experts are skeptical of the dangers of global warming, and many see greater peril in the policies being pursued to combat global warming. That really shouldn't surprise you. Energy is the lifeblood of our economy. Most of it, about 85%, comes from fossil fuels, and carbon dioxide is the inescapable byproduct of fossil energy use. Can we really just freeze emissions without chilling our economy? Can politicians force us to cut emissions by 70% or more without destroying our prosperity? And can we deny fossil energy to developing countries without trapping millions of people in deadly poverty? I'm Marlo Lewis of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. You're watching Policy Peril. We hear a lot about the supposed dangers of climate change, but almost nothing about the hazards of climate change policy. In this film, we'll review the science to see if global warming is the menace Al Gore and others claim it is. We'll also examine the economic, health, and environmental risks of the policies they advocate. And finally, we'll consider alternative policies that are more likely to help humanity flourish in the 21st century. We often hear that global warming will increase the frequency and severity of heat waves. People will drop like flies. Sounds plausible, doesn't it? But wait a minute. Summer air temperatures in U.S. cities have been rising over the past 3 decades, in part because cities generate heat islands, which expand as cities grow. Yet heat-related mortality has gone down.
Bob Davis and I did some work at UVA on heat-related mortality and published it in the refereed literature, showing that more frequent heat waves are, the fewer people die. That's because they adapt. And in the average American city, the average of all American cities, heat-related mortality is going down significantly, not up. In fact, in the cities in the southern United States, Phoenix, which has a very old population, Tampa, there's hardly any heat-related mortality at all.
As long as politicians don't make electricity so costly that low-income households can't afford to run their air conditioners, heat-related death rates should continue to decline even in a warming world. But maybe the heat will get us by creating more air pollution. That's what the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, said in a report titled Heat Advisory. It sounds plausible because smog forms when emissions of nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds bake in the heat of the sun. However, the NRDC report is fundamentally flawed.
NRDC uses emissions from 1996 to predict, in quotes, ozone levels, smog levels in the 2050s. So we're already about 30% or more below the emissions of 1996, and emissions continue to drop because of fleet turnover to cleaner vehicles, because power plants are getting cleaner, and most of those emissions are going to be gone in about 20 years, and by the 2050s there's going to be hardly any air pollution in the air. But NRDC assumes that we're going to have 1996 emissions levels in 2050.
Like heat-related mortality, air pollution levels have fallen as cities have warmed. U.S. air quality should keep improving regardless of climate change. We also hear that global warming will expose us to tropical diseases, such as malaria. For example, Al Gore blames global warming for recent malaria outbreaks in Nairobi, Kenya, which, he claims, used to be too cold for malaria-carrying mosquitoes to breed. But 2 clicks of the mouse bring us to the World Health Organization's website and a study on malaria in Kenya. Malaria was a big problem in Kenya, including Nairobi, way back in the 1920s and 1930s. Malaria is chiefly a disease of poverty, not of climate.
Well, first of all, in the United States, malaria was endemic in the 19th century, all the way up to the Canadian border, up into the Red River Valley. Temperature was about a degree cooler in the 19th century, U.S. continental average, than it is now. So malaria thrived in a cooler climate. It doesn't need warm temperatures. What it needs is poverty. It needs lack of sanitation. It needs lack of pesticides. Yeah, that'll get you some malaria at today's temperature. It's doing very fine and has been for a long time in Africa because it's poor. You want to fight malaria? Don't worry about climate change. Worry about poverty.
What about hurricanes? Gore says there is a, quote, strong, new emerging consensus that global warming is making hurricanes stronger.
I can find a whole bunch of papers that say yes, a bunch of papers that say no, a bunch of papers that say I don't know.
Here is a study Al Gore will never cite. Phil Klotzbach of Colorado State University measured changes in hurricane strength in the world's 6 major hurricane basins from 1986 to 2004. There's an increase in the North Atlantic, a decrease in the Northeast Pacific, and not much change anywhere else. To persuade us that hurricanes are becoming stronger, Gore reports that economic damages from hurricanes increased dramatically in recent decades. He shows this on a graph, similar to this one. But the graph is misleading. Consider this fact. More people today live in just 2 Florida counties, Dade and Broward, than lived in all 109 coastal counties from Texas to Virginia in 1930. There's tons more stuff in harm's way than there used to be. No wonder damages are bigger.
If you take a look at hurricane damages and adjust them for population levels, for property values, the things you have to adjust for inflation, you find that there is no significant increase in the damage rate. In fact, the 1926 Florida hurricane is the record holder by far, about, I believe, $50 billion more damage than Katrina in today's dollars. So there's just no link here.
Gore cites a study that found an increase in the number and percentage of strong Category 4 and 5 hurricanes since 1970.
If you restrict your study to beginning, say, around 1970 or 1975 because you want to have only satellite data, well, that was a low point in the annual progression of hurricanes. Start your study back in 1950 when the Hurricane Hunter aircraft started giving reliable data, and what you see is no change.
In this graph, the number and percentage of strong Atlantic hurricanes increased from 1970 to 2004, but there is no trend from 1950 to 2004. How will global warming influence hurricanes in the future?
Tom Knudsen published a paper back in 2004 during the height of a very active hurricane season that said, well, hurricanes are going to increase about 6% in wind speed over 80 years. And everybody who read the paper said, big deal. You'll never see that because there's so much noise in hurricane seasons from year to year. And now he said, oh, wait a minute. We might not even get that much of an increase. That even those numbers are being backed down. Bankston in Germany has been publishing papers for years using climate models that say hurricane frequency will decrease in a warmed world.
And what about Katrina? Al Gore portrays New Orleans as a global warming victim.
The devastation in New Orleans in Katrina was a civil failure. It wasn't a weather-related failure. Katrina was a Category 1 hurricane by the time it got to New Orleans. There was no wind measured at 75 miles an hour or higher in New Orleans. What happened is the levees failed.
A civil failure. Public officials failed to provide adequate flood defenses for a city located below sea level in a known hurricane corridor. After watching all those scenes of storms, floods, and wildfires in An Inconvenient Truth, you might suppose the world is becoming a more dangerous place. Not so, says Indor Goklani, author of the book, The Improving State of the World.
Actually, we have data for the world for extreme events due to weather going all the way back to 1900. Now, I think the data in the early part of the 20th century is probably not very good, but it's the best data that we have. And what that tells us is that from the